He was a lively presence, both in our classrooms and in the poetry scene back then. And when he made his escape back to New York City, whence he came, he was sorely missed. Since then, we've seldom seen him, but news of and from him has steadily arrived here. He has published 8 poetry volumes, among whose titles my favorite are New York Hello and, especially, Cabal of Zealots. Some of these elegant volumes are richly illustrated, for Vincent is deeply involved in the New York art world, in which he works both as an art critic and sometimes as a curator. In 1991, he published a volume called Charms, a translation of Book 1 of Propertius, the Latin love poet, and in 2004, Princeton University Press brought out his translation of all 4 books of Propertius. This volume won the 2005 prize from the American Literary Translation Association. I need not tell you that truly successful efforts to render ancient Latin verse into living American poetry are few and far between. You don't need the fingers of both hands to count those published in living memory. Vincent's Propertius, whose language and rhythms deftly combine antique and elegance with sidewalk New York, is one of these. I give you Vincent Katz.
Thank you very much for that introduction. It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you all for coming tonight, this evening. Well, the idea for the talk I'm going to give came about from a certain problem that I've been having, or a crisis, perhaps. And I feel that I'm at some kind of a crossroads in my life right now, and it's actually very appropriate to be back here in Chicago, because a lot of what I've been thinking about has to do with that time in my life and the decisions that I made then and what they mean now. So I decided to basically go through my life and my exposure to different influences in poetry. And the title of the talk is The Poet's Fate. I am a poet. Difficult sentence. For poetry is something that's not valued in our culture, in our society. And in fact, in some places it's used as a derogatory term. A poet is somebody who's shiftless and good for nothing. And I always felt the burden of this judgment very heavily. And, well, I think perhaps others of us who are not poets also feel a certain unease when asked, what are you or what do you do? But it's still difficult for me to say I'm a poet unless I'm with people that I know are lovers of literature. So there's always some kind of obfuscation, or I write about art, or I'm a teacher, or whatever way that one finds to avoid that fate. And so I felt that I felt a burden to be something more, what if I was more than a poet, something more valued and more significant. So I sometimes think that I was something of a prodigal son, that I left poetry, although I never really left it because it was something that I always enjoyed and could do. So I kept doing it all the time, but I didn't necessarily admit it. And at the same time, after I did my degree here, I got another BA from Oxford University. That was in the classics. And then at that point, I made a decision not to follow an academic path, and I went to try to do something in outside of the academic world. So I kind of see those two things as a certain kind of prodigality, leaving a path, which now I kind of feel like I'm coming back to, perhaps. Although, as I said, poetry was always there. So here's this account. And it's sprinkled with examples not only of my own poetry, but of poets that influenced me. And some of the poems you'll hear, you wouldn't ordinarily hear at a poetry reading of mine, because they're from kind of what I consider juvenilia, but I thought it was interesting to bring them in this context. New York, 1967. I'm a child in New York City in the 1960s. Flower power. 1, 2, 3, 4. We didn't want your fucking war. The Beatles and the Rolling Stones. Television, that deadening and subduing megalith, also provides a significant aesthetic introduction. The Beatles performing on the Ed Sullivan Show. My mother, who loves Billie Holiday and Beckett, buys me Beatles albums. She also buys me a 45 of the Rolling Stones single, Paint It Black. But mainly it is hours and hours listening to the Beatles. Someday you'll know I was the one, but tomorrow may rain, so I'll follow the sun. Ever since that moment, I've never been able to escape the fact that popular song can be a kind of poetry, a poetry that is clear, accessible, and, if it is good, unpretentious. At the same time, I'm becoming aware of another source of accessible imagery, the paintings my father is making and which hang in our loft. His studio is in the front part of the loft, which gets light from Fifth Avenue, reflected off the Flatiron Building, while we live in the back. The pictures in his paintings grow on me, exerting a subliminal force over time. I can see right away a lake or a tree or a person, but there are other visual meanings I cannot figure out immediately. The colors and light have significances which change over time. Later, I would hear my father say, I want to make paintings that the truck driver who comes to pick them up can appreciate. It was a democratic and ambitious attitude that resonated with pop music's ambitions for lyrics. One day, over lunch in Rio de Janeiro, Kenneth Koch proved to me that song lyrics are not poetry in the sense that if you strip them of their music, they do not stand with the greatest poetry. But that is another way of stating the obvious fact that songs are an alchemy of music and lyrics. R. Crumb's cartoons are like pop songs. His drawings and words on their own do not amount to much, but together they provide pungent social observation. Haven't you often heard a promising song intro that collapsed the instant the singing started? Singing is different from poetry, too, in the role played by the singer's physical voice. Another difference is recognition time. A performance has to be experienced in the present. Song's fashion moves more quickly than poems. New York, 1967. My parents are friends with the New York School poets. Contemporary poetry is always nearby. The first poem I remember is Ed Sanders' Elm Fuck poem, a sex ritual invocation for a man and a tree nymph. As a child, I don't understand any of that, of course, only that the elm is a tree I know, and here it is featured in a poem. I begin writing poems. This is the first one I wrote. I catch a cricket and a grasshopper in the same hand. One night at his place on Greenwich Avenue during a long dinner party, Kenwood Elmsley invites me upstairs to a comfortable room and sits down at his typewriter. Everything you say, I'm going to type, he says. What do you want me to say, I ask. What do you want me to say, he types. And on it goes. At the end of the page, he pulls it out and gives it to me. It is a lesson in the availability of modern poetry and its sources. In fact, it is not even a lesson. It is simply a way of having and giving pleasure. It shows me that poetry can have a social function. I wake up before everybody else and watch early black and white Mickey Mouse cartoons on television. A typewriter has made its way into my room. I write a series of short texts like the following. November 18th, 1967. I got up and watched TV. I also write imitations of lines from comics in a short novel, Drunkhead Mountain. One night I tell my mother I want to invite someone to dinner. Whom would you like to invite? How about Frank O'Hara? When O'Hara died, I wrote a poem. Frank O'Hara died. He was a poet. He had lots of friends. I was one of his friends. he had some Katz. New York, 1968. We moved to West Broadway. One spring day, the critic and sculptor Scott Burton gives me 2 records, Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band and Magical Mystery Tour, a double whammy that automatically connects me to the era and also to a child's imaginings of art. Everyone is listening to Sgt. Pepper's that year. It is playing at large loft parties. It is a bond between my babysitters and me. Everyone in the art world that I have access to seems to regard it as a necessary medium. My mother takes me to see the Yellow Submarine. While I watch it, she goes to a record store and asks for the latest Beatles record. When it arrives, she says, "There's a problem with this record. I want one with a cover." "That's the way it is," the clerk replies. "They call it the White Album." Half of what I say is meaningless, but I say it just to reach you, Julia. Her hair of floating sky is shimmering, glimmering in the sun. New York, 1971. A new school. Latin is a required course. Salve Magister, salvete discipuli. There is this pleasure which is like a game, but it is not a game. It involves real people who spoke and wrote. Accusative, dative, genitive, nominative. There is something about its being in the past. There is no country where they speak this language. It becomes a dwelling built around me, month by month, year by year. At 11, 12 years old, we are learning the words, the stories. At 14, we are reading Virgil. And at 14, I fall into the world of poetry for real. New York, 1974. A group of friends. We read and write poetry together, listen to records, write collaborations. Our influences are Frank O'Hara, John Ashbery, Kenneth Koch, James Schuyler, and in a different way, Ted Berrigan, Dick Gallup, Ron Padgett, Ann Waldman, Louis Warsh, Tom Clark. Ashbery's book, The Tennis Court Oath, 1962, is important for the success of its radical experimentation. It succeeds in transforming mundane materials and methods into brilliant music and has remained a benchmark for me. We own copies of the LPs John Giorno, of Dial-A-Poem fame, puts out as Giorno Poetry Systems. We can hear the voices of our favorite poets, and the discs serve as potent aids to memorization. What had you been thinking about? The face studiously bloodied, heaven-blotted region. I go on loving you like water, but there's a terrible breath in the way all of this. You were not elected president, yet won the race. When you read all the way through fog and drizzle, when you read, it was sincere. The coasts stammered with unintentional villages. The horse strains, fatigued, I guess. The calls, I worry. There are other steady models for a new kind of poetry, post-meaning, and also different from first-generation models. I'm thinking of certain early poems by Padgett and Gallup mainly, where there's an intimate but hardly defined relation between the title and the piece. The title takes on a significant role in the semantic, not merely a one-word synopsis of the poem. This can be liberating to the writing process, as the discovery of a title can prompt a whole poem obliquely appropriate to it. Joe Brainerd is another influence, as both writer and visual artist, illustrator and collaborator with many of the poets I admire. He designed the cover and also wrote the blurb to Padgett's book, Great Balls of Fire, 1969. And this is the blurb. Ron Padgett is a poet. He's always been a poet, and he will always be a poet. I don't know how a poet becomes a poet, and I don't think anyone else does either. It is something deep and mysterious inside of a person that cannot be explained. It is something that no one understands. It is something that no one will ever understand. I asked Ron Padgett once how it came about that he was a poet, and he said, "I don't know. It is something deep and mysterious inside of me that cannot be explained." New York, 1976. But when I read my first poems of trying to write seriously, although they are not mature, they are different from those cherished models. This is from a poem called Tears of Anger, 1975-76. An ominous wind had surrounded our bodies. already this year, as we stood in empty subways, holding each other and crying. This specter, wakened to my open vision so early in the season, burns my face with hot tears of air. As the fragments pass, fleeting before our watery pupils. Seated on a park bench, we gather our senses and, suddenly, get up and leave, a new light hanging over our heads. As I read this early poem and see its punctuation, feel its phrasing and line breaks, its clustered stanzas, I remember other influences then that played a part in this poem, Paul Blackburn and Robert Creeley. These are not coming from school at all, and probably not from my parents, but rather from friends, from the widening circle of shared pleasures, and the productive competition of the question, have you read X? There is something else creeping into my poetry, or, as I prefer now to think of it, there is something in me already, my character, the Greeks would say, that requires other poetries, a transformation ultimately, or fusion of elements. For now, it is a passion for poetries that fill a need. The need is for the direct, how to write emotion in a way that is real, not literary, to get the power of emotion in language my own. To get to that, we write countless imitations, to get the rhythms down, the tones. There is no hope of putting emotion in poems without technique. A poet like Blackburn provides useful clarity. This is his poem, Love Song. Upon returning home tonight, and it is a home now, surely, being the animal I am, when I had undressed, I wrapped my hand around my balls and their now limp appendage, and afterwards smelled my hand. It was you. As your perfume is still on my undershirt, so this perfume also. There is a simplicity to this lyric, in that places are evoked without being described at all, and a tenderness, the being together of the lovers, their present separation, and their metaphysically continued being together. It is at this time also that I become interested in the poetry of Allen Ginsberg, not so much the iconoclastic poems like Howl and Kaddish, but rather romantic cross-cultural poems like At Apollinaire's Grave. Peter Orlovsky and I walked softly through Père Lachaise. We both knew we would die, and so held temporary hands tenderly in a city-like miniature eternity. Roads and street signs, rocks and hills, and names on everybody's house, looking for the lost address of a notable Frenchman of the void, to pay our tender crime of homage to his helpless men here, and lay my temporary American howl on top of his silent calligramme. That's the beginning, and then the end of the poem is, Famille Bremont sleeps nearby. Christ hangs big-chested and sexy in their tomb. My cigarette smokes in my lap and fills the page with smoke and flames. An ant runs over my corduroy sleeve. The tree I lean on grows slowly. Bushes and branches upstarting through the tombs, one silky spiderweb gleaming on granite. I am buried here and sit by my grave beneath a tree. I enjoy the aesthetic of the Mimeo Revolution, poetry books and magazines published on the cheap by poets engaged in fertile relationships with the other arts. Lita Hornick's Culture Foundation, that's Kulchur, exhibits the aesthetic on a slightly higher economic plane. Anne Waldman's book, No Hassles, an unhinged book in parts, is a good example. It contains art by Joe Brainerd, Donna Dennis, and George Schneeman, and the book is dedicated to Edwin Denby, a poet born some 40 years before Waldman, but connected personally and aesthetically to the poets of her generation. Denby's Mediterranean Cities sonnets, published collaboratively with Rudy Burkhart's photographs of Greece and Italy, are an important access point to classicism for me. As a critic, Denby had an idea of classicism that he related to Willem de Kooning's paintings. In his poetry, he clearly drew on classical models while attempting to keep his language contemporary. And this is his sonnet, Brindisi. Where nervous I stand above nocturnal ships, the Appian road ends with one pillar at the shore. Ghostly Greece whispers in the waves' lapping lips, lips Virgil heard here, sweet Virgil, dying in despair. The old woman who sees him sleeps in that house. By his boots she knows him, his long white coat. He foretells lottery numbers, courteous. But she don't win, she says. She don't read numbers good. Harbor, lost is the Greece when I was 10 that seduced me, godlike it shone. In a dark town, trembling like a runaway boy on his first homeless night, ahead I rush in the fearful sweep of longing, a dead longing that all day blurred here the lone clear shapes which light was defining for a grown man. My own poems begin to include an intimation of classical influence. I also acknowledge directly in the manner of the New York School, but also, I would find later, in the manner of many classical poets, personal friends whose presences have touched me. This is the beginning of a poem of mine called Tonight from 1981. You showed me the moon, hung over the city like a scoop of vanilla ice cream, and I stepped into the subway. It's January 1st, and lights throb on the shiny avenues. People, too, are filled with light as they get up and move through the city, their home, to be with other people or alone. There is a ready amiability in this, as the policeman said hi to Ada and me at the Times Square station last night. Everything seems so well timed today. Meeting Edwin at the corner of 23rd and 3rd by chance tonight, he said he was just looking at a new neighborhood he'd never seen. We passed the 23rd Street Bar and Grill, which used to be one of his favorite places, an Irish restaurant. Then I came uptown and met you, and you fed me. And it continues. Impressed by the story that Shakespeare hardly blotted a word, already in high school I had developed a technique for writing poetry based on getting it right the first time. The ear has to be in tune while writing, and the rhetorical flow also has to be coherent. I do edit my poems, but I believe the poem is made in the writing, not in the editing. Only once have I successfully edited a poem into being. Chicago, 1978. I don't have a good idea of where to go to college, just that I want to get out of New York. You don't find your fate, it finds you. University of Chicago's philosophy appeals to me. My friend, Larry Rosen, who has been there, assures me it will be, quote, like going across the Arctic on a dog sled, quote. I also don't know what I will major in. I follow my interests. As I have some preparation in Greek as well as Latin from high school, I take courses at U of C on Herodotus, Horace, Aeschylus, Greek elegy, Homeric hymns, Aristophanes, and Euripides. My academic life is finding its way into my poems, both formally and literally. Herodotean Weekend, the branch caught in window frame, lips of a different tongue Cyaxares had his sons taught. Tonight, warm breath heaved through the Victrola's leafy visage, and Saturday blessed dusk with appearing streetlights, and the soft-colored grass as he approached the girl, asked the water fountain, wading through yellow bus to Monday morning, more dark than night, with lights revolving in softly falling rain. There is a blending of classical ideas and images with a modern indeterminacy of syntax. My poetry is becoming more somber or measured than that of my New York School models, somber in the sense of not being as light in manner. A classical balance is sometimes apparent. Combined with a native New York School looseness, this could lead to a new style, though I don't think of it in those terms at the time. Spring frost. Such a warm light as in Greece descended, but flying with snow, not sand, along this April ice on window frame appended. The caryatids in the morning paper now I read, or some current magazine, have been removed to safety in the Acropolis Museum from their sunburnt haunt, Athena's temple, and Erechtheus, its noble head upended in spring's everlasting breath, chasmal and a freeze. Kids throw snow in the lot across the street. it melting, while in here, colorful records covers warm the occupants amid valuable articles strewn the room around. O gods, let the seasons come, but not before their appointed time. And like for us who breathe their air, let us live through the amount that having it is right. Music is a major part of my picture while at Chicago. I study harmony with Easley Blackwood, composition with Shulamit Ron, and music history. My concept is of a wedding of poetry and music, as I become cognizant was the rule in the classical world. I see an analogy between popular songs' alchemy of lyric and tune and the ancient idea that a poem was meant to be sung and sometimes danced to. The Latin word carmen means both song and poem. I've been writing songs since I was 8 or 9, performing in various bands, and this urge returns during my sophomore year. I have found some friends, and music is the glue. We start writing songs together and rehearsing them. Eventually, this takes the form of an active band with a certain local success. So here are 2 song lyrics from the time. You're walking down the street wearing those high-heeled shoes, and all the scurvy masons take the hip on you. You're trying to impress some number in a hat. He's only a professor, not a diplomat. Come on, come on. Let me show you what I know and what I see. Come on, come on. Then put on electric blue and cause misery. And this is from a different song called Danny and Renee. They walk down Hyde Park Boulevard on a sunny summer day, smoking their 2 last Marlboro. That's Danny and Renee. They're going to a club tonight. Don't think they'll have to pay. Drop over for some conversation first. Bring Danny and Renee. I wish that I could be like them and never have a thing to do. I wish that you could be like them. It's an easy thing to do. Maybe when winter's over, they'll find a place to stay. Be sure you get invited then to Danny and Renee's. There is a distinction here between lyrics, which are more regular in terms of meter and rhyme, and poetry, but they influence one another. Language in the songs is playful, and song lyrics invade the poems. This is a poem called Memorial Day. 1981. I want to call you so bad. It's not Memorial Day, but there's something I want you to remember, to not be vicarious, gulping. The sudden thought of city arms empty. You just called. Everything you said went straight to my head. Trashy film clip is all there's left to look at in the soot-sullen noon. And spoons. I remember your neck. Gurgling certainties surround my glossy eyes, fastened to your white heels today. Sitting on the grass next door to the reception, I saw her today at the Fountain Planet. Are you single? The rims of the crevasse radiate obesely in the Saturn pattern of frozen keys. I remember your fingernails today, bright pink. Ooh, I'm on fire. One of those nights. The luxury of you a phone call away. Tomorrow, I prefer bicycles to cars. Ears I'd like to kiss. Billy took 2 of the 4 Tylenol he gave me for my birthday. You just dropped in to leave your bag and go to a party. I have to put things in boxes. It says chow on it, like I always say when I leave your house. You look so good. One of the nights you feel like. I remember your eyes. You just called from the party to say you were bored, I think. There's a nice song on the Soul Station. I've almost got everything in boxes. I have to get my sheets in a minute, and I've got to finish this, so I'll be dressed when you come. I started a poetry group at the university with another friend in order to bring poets we like to read on campus. We organized readings by Berrigan and Paget, Elaine Equi, and Jerome Sala, among others. Influenced by Alice Notley's poems, I write a sonnet sequence. Musical references abound in these sonnets. This is the first one. Great spacious grace, the record player, pink flowers, however blandished, face pinkly squared, diamonds. Half of what I say is meaningless. Seashell eyes, purply imbued, fleshly, shimmering fastness, grimace, milk, glimmering love last week, Alban Berg walking from all you're saying, graying, simple poppies, bedtime, repetition of magnetic what, your touch, your lips, light, but there, evening's electricity from spunky delight, sleep, delicious fountain, morning breathes too near to hold your hand. By the time I am leaving U of C, my poetry has taken on a noticeable engagement with clear emotion. This is part of a conscious decision to distance myself from what I see as a mannered abstraction in much of the non-academic poetry of the time. I become interested in how to contain strong emotions in poetic forms. A certain preconception may be useful. It is a challenge to try out poetic forms, as much of the poetry I am reading is informal to an extreme. Denby is a model here, and I begin to look at poets from the more distant past. One who strikes me then for his ability to control emotions' expression by poetic means is Sir Walter Raleigh. Reading Raleigh now, I'm still impressed by his technique, but I cannot submit to a pessimistic view of life. One might as well stop living. I hear the voice still of Frank O'Hara. Although he died young, and it could be argued he might have turned pessimistic with time's ravages, I do not think he would have. Pessimists are made young. It is just as easy for a pessimist to learn to hope as for an optimist to give up hope. A final Chicago poem written in June of 1982, a consciousness of ending. Poetry as an aid to see time passing, a recognition or admission of that. Tonight. Tonight is the most perfect night, and I'm sharing it with you. So don't be blue that tomorrow I have to leave. Be true to the feeling that expresses itself succinctly and spread across the entire Midwest, in this city and neighborhood. Hyde Park, its luminous, lush foliage crinkles around you. In night's heat, the blocks are long and empty, but for lovers lingering under ash or elm. These blocks are long. I said you'd mean it, and you did, striped and sweating. Now it rains. Last night's drizzle remembers. In a different city, you will cling to other ways and others' gazes. As stars blink, those whose feet continue, the year's procession will amaze us. At the same time, my involvement with the classics is leading to my first forays into translation, principally the Odes of Horace. And this is one. What slender youth, sprinkled in liquid odors, makes advances to you amid many a rose, Pyrrha, under a lovely cavern? For whom do you tie back your blonde hair, simple in elegance? Oh, how often will he mourn the faith and the changeable gods, and how often will he wonder, unused to seas rough with black winds, who now delights, thinking you golden, who hopes you are always unmarried, always loving, ignorant of the deceptive breeze. Miserable, they for whom you shine, though untried. A sacred wall with votive tablet shows that I have hung up my damp clothes in thanks to the powerful God of the sea. And I also translated at that time a number of Greek elegiac poets. And this is a short poem by Theognis. No one, Cernus, is himself responsible for failure or triumph, but the gods are the givers of both these things. No mortal works knowing in his heart whether it will turn out good or bad in the end. For very often we do good, though intending to do evil, and then do evil while intending to do good. There is available to no man as much as he would like. We must endure the extremities of rough helplessness. And we mortals think foolishly, knowing nothing, and the gods make all things happen according to their mind. I've always liked that poem a lot because it kind of lets you off the hook. I think it's sort of like therapeutic, you know, it's not your fault. And regardless of whether or not you believe in the gods. It was at that time that I first encountered Propertius as well in a class taught by Nicholas Ruddle. And I had an immediate identification with his poetry and attraction to it, partially because of this figure of the misère, the miserable lover, that really comes to an extreme in his poetry. And actually wrote some poems of my own that I intended, or I did group them together under the title Carmina, or songs, but it was never published. And so at this crucial moment when I had finished my degree here and my time here, I was very involved with music and uncertain as to what to do, but it was sort of a similar impulse when I felt like I had to leave New York. I had this principle in those days that I had to periodically put myself in a strange alien situation, and that was going to help me not stagnate. I'm not quite sure if that was completely a wise thing to do. However, I decided that I wanted to go abroad, and I had a possibility to do that. And I asked the advice of one of my professors, Arthur Adkins, who gave me very good advice. He was very generous with his time. And after talking to him, decided to do another undergraduate degree at Oxford. And I think that he recommended that instead of trying to do an MA at the University of London or something like that, because he was aware that I had done a more general liberal arts degree, and he thought I could probably profit from an intensive classics course. So that's what I did. Oxford, 1982. Difficult transition, the leaving behind again, the giving everything up. Rock and roll gone forever, though I didn't know it. I write a long poem sequence, Letters from Earth, the title taken from an E.E. Cummings book I find in someone's apartment my last visit in Chicago before leaving for England. The poem sequence begins in Chicago, red telephone, bent lamp by 55th Street window. Continues by tracking confusion, I don't even want the things I want. Arrival in England, my first night in London, I have the worst cold. An ultimate entry to new, empty life, waiting to be filled, which begins to happen later in the poem. This is a poem from that sequence, or an edited version of it. I know no one here, I doubt whether anyone, I know no one here can know the longing I feel finding a book, The Greek Dialects, by Carl Darling Buck, here at Oxford in the St. John's College Library. Maybe because I remember his picture so well, hanging in the Classics building at Chicago with other past classicists. An easy, friendly, definitely American smile on his face. Maybe it's because I've seen his name hundreds of times on the reading room shelves of the 5th floor of the Regenstein Library, in the pursuit of my studies, in that part of that life that became so enjoyable. Whatever happens here, that part of my life has become so complete. Wondering today what I'm doing here with no friends, I thought back on freshman year in Chicago, momentarily longed for that feeling, so far gone now, but not really gone, like in the photograph. Would Mrs. Burnett know how I feel, perhaps? While at Oxford, I do translations of Tyrtaeus, a speech from Sophocles' Ajax, and a poem by Ovid. The role of translation is of a kind of exercise, a pleasure, like playing tennis, with the difference that at the end you are left with a literary work. Classical subject and rhetoric continue to affect my own poetry. This is the beginning of a poem of my own from 1984. That your book sits so greenly and beautiful, pressed new pages and crisp paper folder, that your poems express such warmth of wit and urbane sentimentality, I can just picture you in your villa in the Gianicolo, smoking a cigarette at the typewriter, You pause on a word, and the soft trickle of the fountain outside reaches your ears. Through opened window, the freshness of foliage, and distantly the sweep of cars in late afternoon, the taste of sex and wine. That you two love words almost as much as women, this gratifies me, since it makes me your friend. Another poem of ending. This is from a poem from July of 1985 to the end of that period. Where does it come from, feeling bad or good? It seems so real, inevitable, but it's just a feeling, nothing more. It's hard to see where one is, surrounded by so many different greens. Bees buzz and a bird flaps. Their song continues, and their work. For one human, it is hard to know where work begins. Hard not to feel like the deserted gazebo by the night shore, happily blinking, without an audience. Oxford, 1985. I write to Penguin to see if they may be interested in a new translation of Propertius. I receive a reply thanking me for my letter and stating that, quote, unfortunately, this work is already in the process of being translated by W.G. Shepherd and will be published in March 1986. Boston, 1985 to 87. At 25 years old, I decided to move to Cambridge, Massachusetts to pursue a musical career. This attempt continues with various ups and downs until 1993. As a poet, I am past the apprentice phase and have entered the phase of being a professional writer, although it will take some time for me to assume the obligations that entails. Creatively, I search for situations in which to write poetry differently, to make each writing project distinct from those that preceded it. These situations include collaborations with visual artists, translation, and self-imposed writing rules. I translate a fragmentary Archilochus papyrus, publishing it in 1988. This interested me because it was a papyrus that most times when we get fragments, it's a little scrap of paper, but usually there's a line or two and then maybe some fragments of words. But this seemed to be a papyrus that had been ripped vertically, so there was half of every line for a number of lines, which made it very modern, unbeknownst to the poet. Of now all smoked around ships, sharp of hostile, and it dried to the sun, recklessness, who greatly long for you can of Naxians and the stump of trees. Men restrain this, the peopled, as not angry beside, and of brothers, some cut fig leaves, he stumbled to blows, these my heart from the bottom, but still died. Know now, if your expressions intend, which in Thasos and Toranaya, and who in swift ships, and from Paros and sister, heart, fire that really now around in a suburb, they abuse the land, Erxia, ravage, equip onto the road, and not boding good. New York, 1987 to the present. So here are some examples of different kinds of poetry that I've written as a result of collaborations with visual artists. The first book was with the photographer Rudy Burkhart, and we decided to, he was born in 1914, so we had this great difference in age, but we thought it'd be interesting to combine works that we had both done at the same time period, the 1970s and 80s. And so this is the beginning and end of a poem from that book called The Way That I Feel. The huge open washy expanse of Michigan Avenue curls up to the twilit heavens. I Magnin and the water tower form a valley that cars crowd down below and people, but above I soar to greet the generations of Chicagoans at ease beneath a tree. And the ending is, the evening glitters as I hang up the phone, alone with my friends and rooms that caress the eyes of sleep, a newspaper lying carelessly amid dirty glasses, and the few precious things we remember to communicate. Burkhard and I decided to do another book in which we took kind of an opposite approach. Instead of work that we did at the same time, we decided to combine work that we did while we were approximately the same age, which in his case meant photographs that he took in New York in the late 1930s, and then also some work in Europe as well. And it was also different because everything that I wrote was in direct response to his photographs. So I obviously never would have written these poems without having had that encounter. And here's one of them, just to give you an idea. I often think that these poems cannot really be taken out of the collaboration because they depend so much upon one another, or the poems depend on the photographs. Here's one. Impossibilities of space impounded on itself, simple clarity of everything in the huge spread where man is dwarfed. And that was a poem of a post-war scene of a kind of bombed area. And so you just saw this kind of rubble, which in Burkhart's work, he rarely makes a direct social commentary. And this isn't a social commentary. You just see it as kind of an image, and the rubble is actually kind of beautiful. And then as you look at it, you notice that the scale suddenly surprises you because you see that there's a walking figure in the middle of this vast waste. A little later, I collaborated with a visual artist and drag queen named Taboo, and we had a lot of shared sensibilities in terms of music and cultural references, so that it made that work go together easily. And this is a poem. In fact, the poems were not written for the work. They were written earlier than the paintings were done. And that was an interesting process for me in that I wrote these poems in a notebook, and the only rule I had was I never read anything until I got to the end of the notebook. So I kept going and going and going and going. And I tried to write in as many different times of day and states of mind as possible. So I often wrote very late at night after coming back from a party or working or something. So I was not reading the poems until I got to the end. And then when I read them, it was very surprising because a lot of them were fragmentary notations, which is what you would expect. But then there were also some very solid and formal poems in there as well. But this is one of the funny, I think, little notational pieces from that book. Anthems from Kings goes between the Try that again. Anthems from Kings goes between the animals and Aretha. Cage is right before Cajun, and John Cale just after. Greater Than One is between Stefan Grappelli and Al Green. Tragic Mulatto between Traffic and Lenny Tristano. And Wreck between Hank Williams and Tammy Wynette. Meat Beat Manifesto lies between Paul McMahon and Miles. So it was one of those little tasks, alphabetizing the records. I did another collaboration with a painter, Hunt Slonim. I was intrigued by the idea that Frank O'Hara wrote a long poem called Second Avenue in the painter Larry Rivers' loft, and they were very close and had been lovers at one point. But it interested me that he had a place that he had an apartment that he lived in, yet he chose to write this poem in the painter's loft. And I wondered what would happen if I tried to do that. So I had a friend, Hunt, that I felt very close to. It was very casual. He said, "You can come over whenever you want." There was no sense of nicety that I had to provide there. And he would just let me wander around. And so I felt this freedom there, and I decided to combine that with a different technique for me, which was, and I was thinking about these poems. I was thinking about Second Avenue by O'Hara, which is pretty abstract, although it's in sentence form. And while he was writing it, Kenneth Koch was also writing a very long poem called When the Sun Tries to Go On, and they were having a friendly competition while they were writing them, and they would show one another these poems. And Koch's poem actually was more in my mind then because he really does dispense with syntax, and a lot of times it's just one word after the other. And that's what I tried to do in this poem, and my method was just to write so fast that I wouldn't have time to mentally edit myself, and then I didn't edit anything later either. So here's just the first 6 lines. It goes on for pages. From Painted Life. Steps, platforms lead down into river, rain pelts architectural puddles, life grows there, tendrils corkscrew upper Karam, dwarfed plethora. The countess pouts behind sanguine inundation, forestry signals through complete color, density swift forgiven intolerable knowledge, birds sit in their feed, buoyed marble stalls, notes in convex mirror, I crawl inch by inch through paint. And at this time also, I had written a lot of poems that were what you would call daily poems, or poems influenced by Frank O'Hara's style, what he called I do this, I do that poems that recount a day, perhaps. And I wanted to get away from that. So one of the things that came into my mind was to have my poems try to be a little bit more abstract, not so predicated on observable reality in the sensory way. And one of my models then in thinking was Robert Creeley, and this is a poem that I wrote at that time, thinking about the way Creeley handles his poems. It's just a section from it. Then, brutal beatings, churches gored by flame. We live surrounded by same. We shine our shoes and don't die, retracing fallen lids that open inside us. Wan fabric stretching. In the early 1990s, I agreed to do a book of translation for Sun and Moon Press in Los Angeles. I want to do an anthology of different poets, Greek and Roman, but the editor, Douglas Messerly, prefers that I translate a book that existed as such in antiquity. I decide on book 1 of Propertius. Ralph Johnson agrees to write the foreword, and the process is a complete pleasure. At some point subsequent, I embark on translating the remaining poems of Propertius. There are approximately 200 pages of Latin poetry. When it is all done, I show it to Anne Burnett, who writes back, generously suggesting some changes to the introduction which improve it. She adds that she misses the, quote, kick-ass quality of my first introduction, but she writes, quote, you must have your reasons. Translating is an odd proposition. You create a literary work, and you become involved with that. But whenever you look back at the original, you realize it is something different. It has its own music and style that can never be changed. One of the pleasures of translation for the poet is the time spent with a master, the opportunity to examine his or her facture at the level of minute detail. Propertius has always been recognized as a technical genius, a master of the possibilities of the elegiac meter. I am always excited by the way his poetry swoops from passages of literary erudition, often accompanied by mythological references, arcane even to some Romans of his time, to sections of blunt colloquialism. I find those shifts extremely moving, and they remind me of similar shifts in the poetry of John Ashbery and other New York School poets. And then I thought it would be interesting to read 3 different translations I did of the first 8 lines of the first poem of the first book of Propertius. So this one I actually rediscovered recently. I had forgotten about it, but I think I did it as an undergraduate. Cynthia was the first to catch me with her eyes and cause me grief, I who had been touched by no desires previously. Then love lowered my look of constant pride, and planting his feet, pressed down my head, until, unrestrained, he taught me to hate honest girls and to live without conscience. And already this frenzy of mine has lasted a whole year, even though I am forced to have the gods against me. So that was maybe the early 80s. And then the version from 1995 that I published is this. Cynthia was the first. She caught me with her eyes, a fool who had never before been touched by desires. I really hung my head in shame when love pressed down on it with his feet. He taught me to hate chaste girls. He was cruel when he told me to live without plan. It's already been a whole year that the frenzy hasn't stopped. Even now, the gods are against me. And then when I came to do the complete poems, I revised the first book. And so this is the version that's published in the 2004 book. Cynthia was the first. She caught me with her eyes, a fool who had never before been touched by desires. Love cast down my look of constant pride, and he pressed on my head with his feet until he taught me to despise chaste girls, perversely, and to live without plan. Already it's been a whole year that the frenzy hasn't stopped, when for all that, the gods are against me. And now I'd like to read two poems by Propertius. I chose two poems that include direct address within a poem. One of the things that's interesting about Propertius's poems is to whom he addresses them and what that means for the particular occasion. This first one, the conceit of it is that it's being spoken by the doorway. The doorway was a motif in Roman love poetry because it was something that the threshold that the lover had to cross in order to reach his mistress, and there was often a problem there. And so Propertius developed this conceit that the doorway itself is speaking. And then within that, he quotes a speech from the lover. The doorway quotes it. So here's the doorway speaking. Once I was opened to great triumphs, doorway famous for Tarpeian modesty. Gold-wrought chariots celebrated my threshold, wet with the supplicant tears of captives. Now I'm disturbed by the nightly brawls of party-goers. Battered so often by unworthy fists, I complain. Ugly garlands hung all over me, and the familiar torches, warnings to the excluded. I can't prevent my mistress's infamous nights. Though noble, I'm betrayed by obscene poetry. Still, she is not swayed to abstain from her fame and lives more shamefully than her era's usual excess. During these nights, I am forced to mourn in heavy complaint due to the long vigils of the tragic suppliant. He never gives my posts a rest, perennially reciting his poetry of grating flattery. And here's the poem that the lover is reciting perennially. Doorway, even crueler than my mistress within, why are you so silent, your hard gates closed to me? Why don't you ever open up and admit my passion? Don't you know how to respond if moved by furtive pleas? Will you never give in and put an end to my grief? Will I have to sleep like a dog on your warm step? Midnight presses me. I lie in full view of the stars. A frigid breeze whips me with morning ice. You alone take no pity on my human sufferings, no response from your silent hinges. If only my words, piercing some crack, could travel to strike my mistress' ears. She may be stubborner than Sicilian rock. She may be harder than iron and steel, but she won't be able to control her eyes, and emotion will well up in uninvited tears. Now she lies in someone's happy arms. My words fall with the nocturnal zephyr. But you alone are the main cause of my sorrow, doorway, never conquered by my gifts. My tongue's petulance has never struck you, and I always speak my mind when wronged. That you allow me to complain till I'm hoarse and spend the whole night in agitation on the street. I've often written poetry to you in new verse and pressed earnest kisses to your steps. How often, traitor, have I turned over before your posts, and I've brought the appropriate offerings with hidden hands. So he speaks, as do all you poor lovers, and he drowns out the morning birds. By my mistress' vices and her lover's constant tears, I am now indicted in unending envy. And this one is from his fourth book of poems. So the first, anyway, there's a progression in his books from the love poems to, let's say, roughly speaking, becoming more involved with his place in the history of poetry. And then in the fourth book, the poems are longer, there are fewer of them, and they're dedicated to more historical topics or kind of essays in poetry form. This is an invention or a fantasy, you would call it, of about a procuress or a madam. But it begins with the poet addressing her, and then it has her speaking and giving her advice to the woman as to what to do. May the earth cover your grave with thorns, procuress, and your shade suffer from thirst, which you can't want. May your manes not come to rest upon your death, and Cerberus the Avenger terrify your ugly bones with a low growl. She was so sly, she'd have gotten Hippolytus, who was denying Venus, to soften. She was always the worst bird for a happy bed. And she'd have convinced Penelope to forget about her husband and to marry the licentious Antinous. Should she will it, lodestone will lose its power to attract iron, and the mother bird to be nurturer to its nestlings. And indeed, should she bring Colina's herbs to the ditch, standing crops would be swept away by rushing water. Daring to impose laws of the enchanted moon, and to change her back to that of the nocturnal wolf, in order to blind watchful husbands with her skill, she plucked out the eyes of undeserving crows with her nail, and she consulted screech owls about my blood, and against me read the hippomanes, growths on a newborn foal. She worked her tricks with words, a smooth one, just as a persistent drip wears away a rock-paved road. And this is now the procuress gets to speak. Her words are of advice to a mistress. If the Dorozante's golden bank in the east pleases you, and the shell that glistens beneath Tyrian water, and you enjoy the texture of Eurypylus Cohen Minerva, and crumbling designs cut from metallic couches, or whatever goods palm-bearing Thebes proffers, and a cup made of myrrha baked in Parthian hearths, spurn fidelity, overturn the gods, let lies triumph, and smash the obligations of damned propriety. Pretending you've got a sugar daddy raises your price. Use pretexts. A greater passion will come running back after a night of love postponed. If by chance he has mussed your hair, anger is useful. Afterwards it will be something to press when peace is bargained for. Finally, when you've promised sex at a per-embrace price, pretend these are the celibate days of Isis. Let Iole heap up Aprils. Let Amyclae hammer out, her birthday's on the Ides of May. He will sit suppliant, your throne in place, write what you will. If he fears these arts, you've got him. Always have recent bite marks on your neck, which he may surmise were given in back-and-forth wrangling. Don't let the invective of an eager Medea delight you. No wonder she brought contempt, daring to be the first to ask. But rather, worldly Menander's costly Thais, when the comic adulteress tricks the shrewd Getae. Adapt yourself to the man's habits. If he belts out songs, be his partner. Get drunk and join the chorus. The guard will watch the givers. While the blood is young, while the year is free of wrinkles, make the most of it, before tomorrow wastes your beauty away. I have seen rose gardens that would have surpassed those of fragrant Pestum, lying baked beneath the morning notus. And that's the end of her speech. The poet continues. With this, while Acanthus sways my girlfriend's will, my bones can be counted through my meager flesh. Seize, O Queen Venus, the throat of the ring-dove, duly cut before your hearth. I saw the phlegm congeal on her wrinkled neck, and the bloody saliva passing through gaps in her teeth, and her rotten breath expire on her paternal mats. Her sagging lean-to with its frigid hearth shuddered. Her funeral will feature stolen bands of scant hair, and a yellowing mitre in filthy decay. and a dog aroused by my excessive suffering, since the bar was always in my way. Let the tomb of the bawd be an old jug with a short neck. May your strength, wild fig tree, press the jug. Whoever you are, lover, smash up this grave with rough rocks, and on top of the rocks, pile a bunch of curses. I thought I'd end by reading a few and thinking about a few lines from Propertius and then a couple from my own poems that deal with the idea of poetry. I started out speaking today of poetry as a marginalized occupation. I've always been aware of its value, but I think it's useful for me to remind myself of its uses. So Propertius says in one of his poems, Mimnermus' poetry is worth more in love than Homer's. Mild love seeks soft songs. So Mimnermus was a Greek elegiac poet who wrote love poems. And so he's saying here that for the use of love poetry, for seduction or for pleasing your lover, that this kind of poetry, which is his kind of poetry, Propertius' poetry, is even more valuable than the great Homer. And he goes on, through his suffering, which is recounted in the poems, he claims to have attained a certain kind of mastery of the art of love, which is also the art of love poetry, which provides another useful function that is inherent in his poetry. I can rejoin separated lovers. I know how to open a mistress' slow doors. I can cure any recent pain. Not light is the medicine in my words. And yet, as his work progresses, as these 4 books evolve, he feels the need to write something other than love poetry. And this is partially an external burden, again, in his case, directly placed on him by his literary patron Maecenas, who was also the patron of Virgil and Horace, and was cultivating these poets both for the pleasure of Augustus and his court and also for the use that their work could provide in celebrating that court. And so there are a number of poems in Propertius in which he responds to Maecenas' requests, in 2 of them with what is called a recusatio, or a reasoned explanation of why he cannot be expected to write poetry that is not love poetry, basically poetry celebrating Augustus. Although he does ultimately write one poem in praise of a Roman victory. But this conflict within him of whether he should keep writing love poetry or not comes up in the poems. And in one poem he writes, Youth sings of Venus pleasures, old age of conflict. I will sing wars when my girl has been written. Although by the end of that poem he already says that he's not ready to do that. In another poem, let me return then to my poetry's orbit, that a girl may rejoice, touched by the familiar sound. Lucky girl, if you are celebrated in my book, these poems will be so many monuments to your beauty. So another series of uses that this poetry can be made to fulfill. And then setting himself up in comparison to models that he had of Hellenistic poets, principally Callimachus, who very famously wrote that a big book is a big piece of crap, and was an anti-epic poet, and wrote very learned and finely chiseled poems. And Propertius writes, it will be enough to have given pleasure like that in Callimachus' books, and to have sung in your modes, Cohen poet. It's another Hellenistic poet he's referring to.
May these writings, he's talking about his own poems, may these writings set boys on fire. May they set girls on fire. In another poem he writes, to me, Bacchus, extend your leaves of ivy, that Umbria, swelling with my books, be proud. Umbria, land of the Roman Callimachus. And turning to my own poems, this is a poem from the book Pearl that I did with Taboo, which ends, I have poems I started 6 years ago, or thought about starting, that I intend to finish. That would never happen with a song. Poetry's fashion moves slower than songs and is less relevant. And poetry, I've often recognized, for me personally, the use of poetry in documenting is not really the right word, but making some kind of translation of the moment that I'm passing through. So it's not necessarily a consolation. It's not an attempt to be that, but it's rather something that starts with an observation of something happening that is passing through time, and then realizing that poetry can be a means to harness that movement momentarily. And in some cases, that has been, well, here's a short quote. This is from a poem called Dichterliebe, which is refers to a poem cycle, which means the love of the poet, the poet's love. And it ends, seeing into time's its trick, the ability to see oneself going by, self going into other selves. And I've written several poems that are elegies for poets, sadly enough. But I guess that is a similar process of feeling that my reaction to something is going to be a poem. So there's one that begins, in the first moments, I pick up not his book, but my notebook, defense against the unconcealable. And then, finally, from a poem called The Walk Home, a song in my head that is poetry. She has always protected me, and always will. And I felt that too, that poetry is a very living force that I feel can give me sustenance or some kind of cushion from the negative impact of things. The more I accept identity as a poet, the more what I have done makes sense. As much as I recognize the value of poetry, it is hard for me to believe in it. I admire people like Ezra Pound and Gregory Corso, who have a fierce pride in being poets and demand it be respected. I am looking at a wall with winter shadows, and I feel that nobody can see that wall the way I see it. And that gives me the license to feel that I can contribute something to human society. And further, that if that wall can be meaningful to me, it can be meaningful to someone else. Thank you very much.